The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Latta and Ranking Member Matsui, for convening today's hearing. And thank you to all of our witnesses for the time that you've taken this morning to testify. It is not surprising to me as I go toward the end of the questioning that a lot of the things that I had prepared to talk to you about this morning have already been covered. But I do want to talk about just a couple of those things and follow up on some of the good questions that have been asked and some of the questions, some of the answers that you've given. Of course, I represent the Houston, Texas area, and so we are very familiar with the importance of AM radio for emergency alerts as well as for all the other purposes we've been talking about here this morning. And I know my constituents care deeply about this issue in the last just couple of months as this issue has been more and more in the news and in our conversations. I've heard from hundreds of constituents in a very organic way about their concerns about making sure that they can continue to have access to AM radio. And so there are certain things we've touched on and I just want to emphasize are really important to us. We've talked a little bit about the importance of being able to communicate in different languages. In my own district, in our area, more than 140 languages are spoken. The idea that you can get to various communities through AM radio is absolutely borne out in our district and really important for communicating within the district. And of course, we are no stranger to weather disasters and other emergencies, unfortunately, summer and winter. And this has been a critical lifeline for us. And so these really are the priorities of our community. And you all have talked a lot about that this morning. So I appreciate your insights. It's been incredibly helpful. What I'm not totally sure, Representative Allen was just asking a couple of questions about this, and I think Mr. Chapman, you were just saying something has changed recently. And I'm not sure we've gotten the answer today about why exactly this move is being made, why the manufacturers specifically on the cars are thinking about removing it. There's some suggestions about whether there's interference with the AM signal and the cars, but as you said, we've had electric cars for going on 2 decades now, and this is a more recent issue. So I think that's something that I would really like to understand better, kind of why it's happening, and I'm not sure we've got the answer to that question this morning. And then the other thing that Mr. Curtis touched on that I think is also important was this question about the transition and the difference between digital and analog. I too love listening to my digital radio here in DC, and I tune it to my Houston public media station and listen to what's going on at home every single morning. But those are the questions, and I think it goes together, kind of this, what's the change? Does it have to do with digital versus analog? And so I'm gonna look to you, Mr. Schmidt, if you could just talk a little bit and try to give us a concise answer on why this is happening now, and then maybe turn to you, Mr. Chapman, for a final comment if we have time.
Thank you for the question. With respect to changes over time, I have to admit my expertise is in the safety end and not in the actual EV architecture. So I'm going to have to come back with you with some information. I think it's a great question and begs the information, but we will provide that for you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would appreciate that if you could supplement. I know we'll have a couple of weeks at the end of the hearing to supplement the record, and I think it's really important for us to understand that. And so I guess can I ask sort of 2 related questions, Mr. Chapman? One, based in your experience, and 2, what we've heard is that there is a move toward digital that could be part of it, but also can you speak to whether not just the expense, but the differences you might see in terms of reach, resiliency, and kind of the depth and strength of the analog and digital signals? Like I said, I love my digital radio, but can you just talk to that and what those concerns and issues might be as well in your answer?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I listened to you talk about Houston and Harvey. Our son was in Houston at that time when 60-some inches of rain in a little more than a day were dumped on the community. And I'll touch on the digital thing in a moment. But what was important is he was prepared because he knew the power was going to go out. He parked his car in a parking garage up on the 2nd level, and so he was going to be in a place at least where he could get information. And the power did go out, and sometimes it was out and on for extended periods. And so that is a way I think a lot of people who are in hurricane areas, prepare when something like that comes up. Just to touch on digital very quickly, it is an option down the road, but right now, broadcasting in all digital, there's a station that's doing it here in Frederick, Maryland. Most people can't receive it. It's only a small percentage of the receivers. It's not an option that's available to us yet. It should be explored, but EAS depends on analog stations.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. And I will just add as I yield back that I too have a weather radio. It's a great thing to have if you're in an area like ours that's entirely weather. But I think it's critically important that we preserve this ability to communicate with everyone in times of disaster. And that's certainly true of our experience in Houston. So again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you so much for holding this very important hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio's 12th District for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. There's no question about the importance of AM radio to my constituents in central and southeastern Ohio. Farmers rely on AM radio for their weather and crop reports. And as you mentioned in your testimony, Mr. Chapman, individuals and families living in broadband deserts rely on AM to stay connected to their communities. Mr. Chapman, in your testimony, you often refer to the AM signal as resilient. Can you please briefly explain the difference between AM and FM signals and why you believe the AM signal is more resilient than the FM?
Congressman, thank you for the question. Touching on the difference in properties, say, for example, between AM and FM, the FM signal is much shorter. The AM signal is a much longer wavelength. And what that means is a longer wavelength travels a much larger distance. So that's one of the properties. It also will go through solid objects, unlike what a shorter FM signal will. So there's ways that it can certainly adapt. And in the evening, for example, you know, those that might listen to an AM radio station hear one from a great distance away. So there's different things that are signal properties that are really important to the AM band that the FM band doesn't possess.
Okay, thank you. As my colleague, Ms. Fletcher, said, a lot of the questions have been asked, but in a little different dynamic here. We have been hearing a lot about the analog versus the digital AM radio signals. In 2020, the FCC issued a report and order authorizing AM radio stations to voluntarily transition to an all-digital signal. Back to you again, Mr. Chapman. I apologize. Do any of your AM radio stations broadcast on a digital signal, and can you explain the benefits and drawbacks of digital AM radio signal versus a traditional analog signal?
Congressman Balderson, I would welcome the opportunity if it was a good opportunity for us to transition to digital AM. Unfortunately, most of our listeners can't receive digital signals on the AM band. There's differences in the receivers and such. And so for the same reason, it's important to keep AM radio in cars in its current format. It's important for us to give access to all Americans for AM in its current form, and it would require a change of receiver standards, which is a different question entirely. And so the reason we don't make that transition is people wouldn't hear us any longer.
Okay. Do you know if any of the AM stations operating as FEMA primary entry points currently broadcast through a digital signal?
No, they do not.
All right, thank you. You're all done from my questioning. Mr. Schmidt, thank you for being here. In the case of electric vehicles, the batteries interfere with the AM signal, requiring filters or shielding to be installed to prevent interference. Following up on my question to Mr. Chapman, is this interference only an issue with the traditional analog AM signal, or would we see the same interference occur with the digital receiver installed with electric vehicles?
Unfortunately, I am, again, a safety engineer, and so I don't have the expertise on that at this moment, but I can certainly bring that back to you.
Okay. Did you want to raise your hand, Mr. Chapman?
Electromagnetic interference has different properties for each band, but if it affects AM, chances are it would affect FM also, whether it was in the digital or the analog structure. And so the shielding that takes place in cars needs to protect AM and FM, and that's generally how they're designed.
Okay. Thank you very much for all of you being here today, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my remaining time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me thank our ranking member as well. Let me thank our panelists for joining us today to discuss this important issue. With the rapid pace of technological advances in communication technology over the past 2 decades, it would be easy to overlook the important role that AM radio has historically played in keeping us all informed, safe, and connected. In addition to often being a primary source of news for immigrant communities, AM radio signals travel farther and can reach far more people than FM radio. What AM radio may lack in sound quality, it more than makes up for in reach and resiliency, making it an essential component of our national public warning system. The redundancies that AM emergency broadcasts provide ensures that Americans have a reliable channel to receive critical information in time of crisis and natural disasters. Additionally, AM radio stations play a crucial role in increasing the diversity of media ownership, as they are more likely to be owned by women and minority ownership groups than FM stations and other media. The premature demise of AM radio would represent a significant blow to efforts to promote diversity and inclusion in media ownership and limit the diversity of programming available to consumers. With that being said, I'm also extremely proud of the American automakers that have stepped up to help usher in a clean energy future by shifting more towards electric vehicles. The transportation sector has long been ripe for decarbonization, and I commend the automotive industry for moving quickly to make a zero-emission transportation future a concrete reality instead of simply a possibility. And as we move towards the future, it is essential that industry leaders and policymakers alike keep public safety concerns at top of mind. We can and must safeguard our clean energy future without sacrificing essential communication channels in the present. Mr. Schmidt, first, let me thank you for your organization's plainly stated commitment to ensuring that drivers continue to have access to public alerts and safety warnings. As you stated in your testimony, there are any number of reasons why automakers make certain choices on vehicle design and features offered. I'd like to get a better understanding of the technological issues at play with respect to AM in EVs. And while explaining decisions to remove AM radio from EVs, some manufacturers have cited electromagnetic interference generated from electric batteries or motors as among the factors impacting that decision. Nevertheless, in a reversal of its decision to remove AM radio from 2024 models, Ford indicated that it plans to issue a software update to vehicles already on the road without AM radio. Mr. Schmidt, my question is, when it comes to addressing electromagnetic interference, are the solutions rooted in hardware, software, or a combination of both?
Well, as I mentioned, from the Ford perspective, they had the hardware in the vehicle. They were planning to remove AM radio, so it was easy to remove it by software. And then when they reversed their decision, they just did use software to bring it back. So I would say that I can't say anything for any other manufacturers other than Ford, because they authorized me to, and I had communications with this committee.
So it remains to be seen. Yes. Mr. Chapman, in your testimony, you spoke to the importance of AM radio search and focus on local communities. Reach and focus. Can you expound briefly on why AM radio is so important for rural, minority, and historically underserved communities, and how these communities could be impacted by the demise of AM radio?
Congresswoman Clark, one of the things that we touched on earlier, but is really important, is the opportunity to get into ownership. We need our ownership to be reflective of the communities where we operate. The cost of entry for an AM station is much less than an FM station. And so oftentimes the stations that program to specific groups that may not be the general market have chosen to go in because it's a business model that's sustainable for them with that cost of entry.
Very well. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
gentlewoman yields back. We'll go next to my colleague from Texas. Congressman Pfluger, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I want to start, Lieutenant Colonel DeMays, just asking a quick question about the security implications. I'm a military guy myself. You always need backup communications, and I see kind of that baseline backup and something that our emergency systems completely depend on. Just give me a brief statement on what AM radio does as a kind of a baseline backup emergency broadcast system and what it does for our security in this country.
Thank you, Congressman. Sure, as a military guy, you recall the old phrase, 1 is none, 2 is 1, and 3 is almost what you need. In the case of emergency management, the ability to have redundancy, the variety of platforms, knowing, again, as I mentioned earlier, that Murphy's Law at some point will intervene, and one, if not multiple platforms will fail at the most critical moment is something that we build into our emergency management processes. We want to make sure that all those resources are able to communicate with the public during a crisis. The AM radio platform in and of itself has the greatest reach of all of our forms of communication with the public and has been proven to be the most consistently reliable.
Well, very good. I think to our local broadcaster in Midland, Texas, Craig Anderson, and, the ability to get information, much needed information out to the population is so important. And it's one of the keys, for broadcasting that we need. Mr. Chapman, from a broadcasting perspective, can you talk to me about the differences between, the digital and analog broadcast and is it changing? And again, like my colleagues, Mr. Curtis and others have said, I want to keep an open mind here, but I know for sure that we need AM radio in this country. And can you talk to me about digital and analog differences?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I'll talk real quickly in terms of the differences with AM in terms of how it's broadcast. What we're most familiar with and what we all listen to is analog AM. The other end of the spectrum is digital AM. And the receivers today, very few of them can receive all digital. What we're also familiar with is what is called hybrid, and that is stations that in band deliver both digital and analog broadcasting. The challenge is for the hybrid broadcasting, it is not a reliable system. It is very finicky. It's tricky to keep it operating well, but it's what we chose as a country through the commission to get to the digital place that we needed on the AM band. The station I mentioned earlier in Frederick, Maryland, is broadcasting in all digital. It sounds like a CD. It's wonderful, but we can't listen to it unless we have the radio that receives it.
It's a great point. So I think, wanted to establish the fact that AM radio is a national security issue. It's an issue for our emergency management system. The receiver is important in this. When I listen to K-Well in Midland, Texas, myself and many other ranchers, farmers, people that are in the oil fields, they may not have a digital receiver or a hybrid receiver. So, Mr. Schmidt, I recently signed on to a letter, and upstairs we're having a committee hearing on mandates from another federal agency. So I'm not a pro-mandate kind of a person, but I am very concerned about the lack of AM radios in vehicles. And I'd like to hear, what your thoughts are on how we continue to allow private markets to work, but also allow our population to have the ability to tune in, because it really is a national security issue.
Yeah, thank you for the comment and question. As I've reiterated, I think our members are fully committed to providing a plethora of options and mechanisms through the iPod system. AM radio is one of them. We also, our members go through and look at the consumer demands, consumer listenership, and that folds into their individual product decisions, which I can't elaborate on any further. But it is, manufacturers now offer a kind of a dizzying amount of options, and I think that's good. And we look forward to working with the federal government, FEMA, and the IPAWS and trying to strengthening the whole system, because understand and recognize through the various strategic plans that even FEMA has concerns about AM radio's future because of the declining listenership. And so we have to look forward at what we can do to provide the kind of the nation with what they need. Thank you.
I would encourage that. It's very important. This is foundational to our national security and to getting information out to the populace. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.